This video contains a fictional story created exclusively for entertainment and inspiration. This content is not intended for educational purposes. The narrative is original and was developed by a human creator with the support of artificial intelligence tools and creative review. No real events or historical facts are being presented as true. London, 1939. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Caldwell Manor with the kind of golden insistence that suggested spring had finally decided to stay. Elizabeth Caldwell stood in what had once been her father's study, now hers by default rather than design, holding an envelope that bore a ducal seal she did not recognize. The wax was deep crimson, pressed with an elaborate crest that spoke of lineage and consequence, two things that had become both anchor and albatross in her 26 years. She had not asked for the letter. She had not, in fact, asked for much of anything in the 6 years since her parents' carriage had overturned on a rain-slicked road between London and their country estate. What she had asked for, solitude, time, the grace to grieve without society's watchful examination, had been denied her with the peculiar cruelty reserved for young women of property who had the audacity to remain unmarried. The envelope felt heavier than paper and wax should feel. Elizabeth set it on the desk's leather surface and stepped back, as if distance might diminish its significance. Through the window, she could see the gardens her mother had planted, now maintained by a skeleton staff that her dwindling resources could barely afford. The roses were budding early this year. Her mother would have been pleased. She had learned, in these 6 years, that inheritance was a word with teeth. The Caldwell fortune, substantial when her father lived, had proven to be a living creature in the hands of solicitors and distant male relatives who believed quite vocally that a woman alone could not possibly manage an estate of such complexity. They had been slowly, methodically, legally stripping away her autonomy, one signature and seized asset at a time. The letter sat there, patient and inscrutable. Elizabeth had become adept at recognizing danger. It came in many forms. In the false sympathy of society, matrons who suggested she might find security in marriage to their decidedly unmarriageable sons. In the carefully worded documents her father's former solicitor presented with increasing frequency, each one designed to transfer another piece of her inheritance to more capable hands. In the silence of old family friends who had decided that association with an unwed woman of questionable financial stability was an inconvenience they could no longer afford. A letter from a duke could only mean one thing: complication. She thought of her mother, who had possessed a spine of quiet steel beneath her gracious demeanor. Margaret Caldwell had never been one for grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but she had taught her daughter that sometimes the most powerful word in the English language was no. Not shouted, not explained. Just stated, simple and irrevocable. Elizabeth picked up her pen, dipped it in ink that had gone slightly thick from the morning's chill, and drew a small sheet of correspondence paper toward her. Her handwriting, her father used to say, was remarkably steady for someone with such a tempestuous inner life. She had never been certain whether he meant it as compliment or observation. She wrote, "Sir, I have received your letter. I return it unopened. Respectfully, Elizabeth Caldwell." She folded the Duke's letter, still sealed, into her response, addressed the outer envelope to the return direction inscribed in elegant script, and sealed it with her family's crest. The wax, green, the color of new things and old money, made a decisive sound as it met paper. By noon it would be in the post. By evening it would be someone else's problem. She did not, in that moment, consider what it might mean to refuse a duke. She did not calculate the potential consequences of returning unopened correspondence from a man whose title alone could open or close every door in London. She simply acted on instinct, the same instinct that had kept her unmarried and unbowed for 6 years, despite every pressure society could exert. What Elizabeth did not know, could not know, was that across London, in a house on Grosvenor Square that occupied an entire block and employed more servants than some villages had residents, Alexander Whitaker, the Duke of Silverton, was about to receive the first genuine surprise of his adult life. The Duke of Silverton was not accustomed to hearing the word no. This was not because he was a tyrant or a bully, though London society harboured both in abundance among its titled ranks. Rather, it was because Alexander Whitaker had learned early that the strategic application of charm, coupled with his considerable resources and impeccable bloodline, rendered most forms of refusal unnecessary. People gave him what he wanted before he had to ask for it directly. It was efficient, if occasionally lonely. He sat in his library, a room that would have made the British Museum envious, reviewing correspondence with his secretary when the returned letter arrived. Simmons, who had been in the Duke's service for 15 years and prided himself on maintaining absolute composure in all circumstances, actually paused mid-sentence when he saw it. "Your Grace," Simmons said, his tone carrying a note that might have been confusion or might have been suppressed amusement. "This appears to be returned." Alexander looked up from the ledger he'd been pretending to read. In truth, his mind had been elsewhere, turning over a problem that had occupied him for the better part of a year: how to extricate himself from the increasingly obvious expectation that he would marry Lady Caroline Pemberton, a woman of impeccable breeding and devastating dullness whom his mother had selected as the ideal Duchess. He took the envelope from Simmons and immediately recognized his own handwriting on what was now the outer wrapper. Inside, still sealed, was the letter he had spent 3 days crafting to Miss Elizabeth Caldwell, a woman he had never met, but whose situation had come to his attention through channels both professional and personal. The note attached was brief enough to memorize. "Sir, I have received your letter. I return it unopened. Respectfully, Elizabeth Caldwell." Alexander read it twice, then a third time. Then he did something he had not done in recent memory. He laughed. "Simmons," he said, still studying the note as if it were a rare artifact requiring authentication, "how long have you been in my employ?" 15 years, Your Grace." "In that time, have you ever known anyone to return my correspondence unopened?" Simmons allowed himself the smallest smile. "I cannot say that I have, Your Grace." "Neither can I." Alexander set the letters on his desk and leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin in an attitude of contemplation. "Tell me what you know of Miss Elizabeth Caldwell." Simmons, who knew everything worth knowing about everyone worth mentioning, did not need to consult notes. "The Caldwell family, Your Grace. Old money, textile mills primarily, though I believe there were shipping interests as well. Both parents deceased approximately 6 years ago. Miss Caldwell is their only child, never married. By all accounts, she's been fighting a rather determined campaign by various relatives to assume control of her inheritance. The general consensus is that she's losing that particular battle." Why did I write to her? It was not actually a question, but Simmons answered anyway. "Your Grace's man of business mentioned that the property adjacent to your Derbyshire estate, Caldwell Manor, would be coming available soon, likely through forced sale. You instructed me to draft a letter inquiring about a potential private purchase that might allow Miss Caldwell to retain certain rights and residence." Ah, yes. Alexander picked up his original letter, the one that had travelled to Caldwell Manor and back without ever revealing its contents. "I offered her a solution to her problems, a generous one, if I recall correctly." "Exceedingly generous, Your Grace." "And she sent it back without reading it." "She did, Your Grace." Alexander felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It might have been respect, or it might have been curiosity, or it might have been the first genuine interest he'd felt in another human being since he could remember. He had expected gratitude, perhaps relief. He had crafted the letter carefully, striking a tone that was businesslike but not cold, offering assistance without condescension. He had expected many possible responses. This was not among them. "Simmons, clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. Your Grace has the Pemberton luncheon tomorrow. Then clear that specifically. Send my regrets. Family matter. Urgent business. Use your considerable diplomatic skills." "Might I inquire as to the nature of this urgent business?" Alexander stood, moving to the window that overlooked the immaculate gardens his mother insisted on maintaining, despite his general indifference to horticulture. "I'm going to Caldwell Manor. It seems Miss Caldwell and I need to have a conversation." "Without an invitation, Your Grace. She invited me when she returned my letter. She just doesn't know it yet." Simmons, who understood his employer better than most, recognized the tone that had entered the Duke's voice. It was the same tone that had appeared when Alexander was 12 and had been told he couldn't possibly learn to fence well enough to compete with the Italian master visiting London. It was the same tone that had surfaced when, at 18, he'd been informed that his proposed reforms to estate management were too radical for serious consideration. It was the tone of a man who had just found something interesting. "I'll arrange for the carriage, Your Grace. Dawn departure." "Dawn departure," Alexander confirmed. "And Simmons, don't mention this to my mother. She'll want to turn it into something it isn't." "Of course, Your Grace." After Simmons left, Alexander returned to his desk and read Elizabeth Caldwell's note once more. The handwriting was steady, educated, clear. The message was polite but absolute. There was no explanation, no apology, no opening for negotiation. It was, he realized, exactly how he would have handled an unwanted intrusion. He found himself wondering what had been in her mind when she'd penned those few lines. Fear? Pride? Simple exhaustion with the endless parade of men who believed they knew what was best for her? In his experience, unmarried women of property were usually desperate for exactly the kind of intervention he'd offered, a way to maintain dignity while accepting necessary assistance. Elizabeth Caldwell had looked at that opportunity and said no, without even reading it. Alexander folded the returned letter carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket. He had built a fortune on understanding what people wanted and providing it before they had to ask. He had negotiated with merchants and ministers, with foreign princes and domestic politicians. He had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with the right combination of money, influence, and strategic charm. But he had never encountered someone who refused to let him try. Elizabeth spent the afternoon in her mother's garden, pulling weeds from between the rose bushes, with more force than was strictly necessary. Physical labor had become one of her few reliable sources of clarity. The staff had diminished to 3. Mrs. Hartwell, who cooked and managed what remained of the household, her husband, who handled the grounds and anything requiring strength, and young Jenny, who assisted with both, and whose cheerful resilience in the face of their reduced circumstances sometimes made Elizabeth want to weep. She had let go of the others one by one, watching her mother's carefully assembled household dissolve like morning mist. Each departure had felt like a small death, another piece of her parents' legacy scattered to the wind. But she had done it herself, personally, ensuring everyone received fair notice and excellent references. She would not have them suffer for her pride. Pride. That's what her cousin Geoffrey called it, the few times he deigned to visit from London. Foolish pride, Elizabeth. There are men willing to marry you, manage your affairs, restore this place to its former glory. All you have to do is accept reality. Reality, in Geoffrey's formulation, meant surrender. She yanked out a particularly stubborn dandelion, roots and all, and felt a small surge of satisfaction. The problem with men like Geoffrey, and there were so many men like Geoffrey, was their fundamental inability to understand that some things were worth more than security. Autonomy, for instance, the right to make one's own mistakes, the freedom to say no. "Miss Elizabeth." She turned to find Mrs. Hartwell standing at the garden's edge, wiping her hands on her apron with the particular gesture that meant she had news she wasn't certain how to deliver. "Yes?" "There's a gentleman caller, miss. He arrived without notice, quite insistent." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. "Geoffrey?" "No, miss. This one's different. Quality. Left his card." Mrs. Hartwell extended a small rectangle of heavy cardstock between 2 fingers, as if it might bite. Elizabeth took it, leaving a smudge of garden soil across the embossed lettering, Alexander Whitaker, Duke of Silverton. Her first thought was impossible. Her second was oh no. Her third was a curious mixture of anger and something that might have been anticipation, which she immediately suppressed. "Where is he?" "I put him in the drawing room, miss. Seemed wrong to leave a duke standing in the hall." Elizabeth looked down at her dress, which was practical cotton suitable for gardening and completely inappropriate for receiving nobility. She had dirt under her fingernails and probably in her hair. Her cheeks were flushed from exertion and sun. Good. Let him see exactly what his unwanted attention had interrupted. Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. I'll receive him as I am. Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows climbed toward her cap, but she was too well trained to protest. Yes, miss. Elizabeth pulled off her gardening gloves and tucked them into her pocket, then walked toward the house with the deliberate stride of someone moving toward battle rather than conversation. Through the drawing-room windows, she could see a tall figure standing with his back to the door, examining the portrait of her parents that hung above the mantelpiece. She pushed open the door without knocking. He turned at the sound, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. The Duke of Silverton was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, certainly not more than 32. Dark hair, grey eyes that assessed her with an intelligence that made her defensive instincts flare. He was dressed impeccably for a morning call, which only emphasized how thoroughly inappropriate she looked. He smiled, which she had not anticipated. Miss Caldwell, thank you for receiving me. I don't recall extending an invitation. No, he agreed, the smile widening slightly. You didn't. Yet here we are. Elizabeth remained near the door, not moving further into the room. It was her house, her territory, and she would not cede ground to a man who had appeared uninvited to discuss a letter she had explicitly refused to read. Your Grace, I believe my note was clear. It was remarkably clear. I return it unopened. Quite definitive. He paused, studying her with an expression that managed to be both amused and serious. It was also, if I may say so, spectacularly unwise. I disagree. You returned unopened a letter that contained a proposal for preserving your home and independence. That seems objectively unwise. It was my home and my independence that prompted me to return it. Elizabeth crossed her arms, aware that the gesture was defensive and not caring. I don't know you, Your Grace. I don't know your motives. And I have learned that unsolicited offers from powerful men generally come with conditions I'm unwilling to accept. A reasonable position, he conceded, though in this case, incorrect. That's precisely what someone with ulterior motives would say. He laughed then, a genuine sound that filled the shabby drawing room and somehow made it feel less shabby. You're right, of course. We've reached an impasse. You won't trust me because you don't know me, and you won't know me because you won't read my letters or accept my calls. I didn't accept this call. You simply appeared. A tactical decision on my part. I apologize for the presumption. He gestured to the chairs. Would you sit? I promise I'm not here to compromise you or make demands. I'm here because I'm genuinely curious about someone who would refuse help without even knowing what form it takes. Elizabeth remained standing. And I'm curious about a duke who would travel from London because one woman returned his letter. Surely your time is more valuable than that. One would think. He moved to one of the chairs but didn't sit, instead resting his hand on its back in a posture that was somehow both relaxed and ready. The truth is, Miss Caldwell, I'm bored. London is full of people who say yes before I finish asking questions. It's efficient but tiresome. You said no before you even knew what I was asking. That's either magnificent confidence or magnificent foolishness, and I find myself genuinely uncertain which. Does it matter? To me, enormously. I have a proposition. I'm not interested in propositions. A business proposition, he continued smoothly. That would benefit us both. I want to purchase the land adjacent to my Derbyshire estate. You own that land. However, I'm aware of your circumstances. Rather than wait for your relatives to force a sale and negotiate with whoever ends up with the deed, I thought it might be more elegant to work directly with you. Elizabeth felt something cold settle in her stomach. You want to take advantage of my misfortune. I want to offer you better terms than you'll get from anyone else. The letter you returned contained a proposal that would allow you to sell the land at fair value, while retaining your manor house and enough acreage to maintain your independence. No marriage, no guardianship, no conditions beyond the property transfer. Why would you do that? Because I don't need a manor house, I need farmland. Because I dislike vultures who circle struggling estates waiting for forced sales. And because... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Because my mother is determined to marry me off to a woman I can barely tolerate, and having a complicated property negotiation in Derbyshire gives me an excellent reason to be elsewhere for several weeks." The honesty of that last statement surprised her more than anything else he'd said. Elizabeth found herself reassessing him slightly, looking past the title and the presumption to see someone who might, possibly, understand what it meant to be trapped by expectation. "So you're using me as an excuse. I'm offering you a fair deal while also solving my own problem. I prefer to think of it as efficient rather than exploitative." Despite herself, Elizabeth felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "And if I refuse again?" "Then I'll wait until your cousin Geoffrey or whoever else is circling forces the sale, buy from them at a reduced price since they'll be desperate to liquidate quickly, and you'll end up with less money and no home. It's not what I prefer, but it's what will happen." "That sounds like a threat." "It's an observation. I'm not the villain in your story, Miss Caldwell. I'm just the person with information you might find useful if you weren't so determined to fight everyone on principle." The words stung because they contained a grain of truth. Elizabeth had become so accustomed to defending herself against men who wanted to control her that she had perhaps stopped distinguishing between actual threats and potential allies. Perhaps. She moved into the room, finally, taking a seat on the sofa her mother had loved. The Duke waited until she was settled before taking the chair across from her, maintaining a respectful distance that she found oddly reassuring. "Tell me," she said. "No letters, no intermediaries. Just tell me plainly what you're proposing. I want 300 acres of your northern property. In exchange, I'll pay fair market value, which my surveyor estimates at £15,000, and I'll include in the deed restrictions that prevent anyone, including myself, from developing within sight of your manor house. You keep your home, the gardens, and enough land to farm or lease as you see fit. The money would be yours, free and clear, to use for restoring the estate or securing your future independence." Elizabeth's mind raced through calculations. £15,000. It was more than she'd expected, enough to settle her father's remaining debts and maintain the house for years. Enough to hire back some of the staff to stop the slow decay that had turned her childhood home into a genteel ruin. "And your price for this generosity?" "I told you. It's not generosity, it's strategy. I get land I need without the mess of a forced sale. You get to keep your home without surrendering your autonomy. There's always a price." "You're right. Here it is. I need this arranged quickly before the summer season begins and my mother's matrimonial campaign intensifies. I'll need you to meet with my solicitors, probably in London. It will take several meetings. People will talk about the young unmarried woman meeting frequently with the bachelor duke. Your reputation may suffer some speculation. My reputation has already survived 6 years of suspicious spinsterhood. I think it can weather a few business meetings." "Then do we have an agreement?" Elizabeth looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see beyond the title and the charm to the man beneath. What she saw was complicated. Intelligence, yes, and strategy, but also a kind of bone-deep weariness that she recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. He was trapped by expectation just as surely as she was, even if his cage was gilded and hers was rusting. "I want it in writing," she said finally. "Every detail. The property boundaries, the development restrictions, the payment terms, and I want my own solicitor to review everything before I sign anything." "Of course. I wouldn't expect less. And if I find any clause, any hidden condition that suggests you're trying to manipulate me or gain leverage, then you walk away," he finished. "Miss Caldwell, I'm many things, but I'm not a liar. When I make a business arrangement, I honor it. You have my word as a gentleman. Forgive me if I place more faith in legal documents than gentlemen's words. That's the wisest thing you've said today." They sat in silence for a moment, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between them. Elizabeth felt the weight of decision pressing against her chest. Every instinct she'd developed over 6 years of fighting for her independence screamed at her to refuse, to send him away, to maintain her defensive posture. But there was another voice, quieter, that sounded suspiciously like her father. "Elizabeth, pride is a luxury. Strategy is a necessity. Learn to tell the difference. I'll review your proposal," she said carefully. "Have your solicitor send the documents. I make no promises beyond that." That's all I ask." The Duke stood, and she rose as well, following him toward the door. At the threshold he paused. "Miss Caldwell, may I ask you something personal?" "You may ask. I may not answer." "Why did you return the letter unopened? The truth, not the defensive version." Elizabeth considered lying, considered deflecting. Instead, she found herself offering honesty for honesty. "Because I'm tired. Tired of fighting, tired of defending, tired of men who think they know what's best for me. That letter, whatever it contained, represented another person trying to solve my problems without asking if I wanted them solved. I returned it because I needed to prove to myself that I still had the right to say no. Even if saying no hurt you. Especially then. What good is autonomy if you only exercise it when it's convenient?" The Duke looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You would have made an excellent strategist, Miss Caldwell, perhaps in another life with different circumstances." "In another life, Your Grace, I wouldn't need to be." He nodded, acknowledging the point, and stepped out into the hall. Mrs. Hartwell appeared from wherever she'd been hovering to show him out. Elizabeth remained in the drawing-room doorway, watching his tall figure retreat toward the entrance. At the door, he turned back. "The documents will arrive within 3 days. Read them carefully. I meant what I said. There are no hidden conditions. Sometimes a business transaction is just a business transaction." "We'll see," Elizabeth said. After he left, she returned to the garden. But instead of pulling weeds, she sat on the stone bench her father had installed when she was 12, when she'd announced that she needed a thinking place. The afternoon air was warm, carrying the scent of roses and possibility. £15,000. Her home, secure. Her future, uncertain, but her own. It was, she had to admit, more than she dared hope for. The question was whether she could trust it, whether she could trust him, whether she could risk believing that perhaps, just this once, someone was offering help without strings attached. She thought about the way he'd laughed when she challenged him, the way he'd admitted to using her situation for his own benefit without shame or artifice, the weariness in his eyes that matched her own. "What do you think, Papa?" she asked the empty garden. "Is he genuine, or am I being a fool?" The roses, budding early, offered no answers. But they had survived the winter just as she had. Perhaps survival wasn't about never taking risks. Perhaps it was about knowing which risks were worth taking. Elizabeth stood, brushed dirt from her dress, and walked back toward the house. In 3 days, she would have documents to review. In 3 days, she would have decisions to make. For now, she had weeds to pull and a house to maintain, and the strange, unsettling feeling that her carefully defended life had just developed a crack in its walls. Whether that crack would let in light or let in danger remained to be seen. 3 days turned into 4, and Elizabeth found herself checking the post with an eagerness that annoyed her. She had not agreed to anything. She had merely said she would review documents that might never arrive, from a man who might have been toying with her for his own amusement. Yet every morning she descended the stairs with her heart beating slightly faster than it should, and every afternoon she told herself she was relieved when nothing came. On the 4th day, a courier arrived, not the regular post, a private courier wearing livery she didn't recognize, but that looked expensive enough to feed her household for a month. He handed Mrs. Hartwell a leather portfolio embossed with a silver crest and left without waiting for a response or a tip, which suggested he'd already been paid handsomely for his discretion. Elizabeth took the portfolio to her father's study and set it on the desk without opening it. The leather was butter soft, the kind that came from Italian craftsmen who charged by the square inch. Even the packaging was an assertion of wealth. She ran her finger along the edge, feeling the stitching, impossibly even done by hand. The room smelled like old pipe tobacco, though her father had been gone 6 years. Some scents, she had learned, didn't fade so much as they settled into the furniture and walls, becoming part of the architecture of memory. On grey mornings she could almost convince herself he was simply in the next room, reviewing accounts or writing letters to business associates in Manchester and Liverpool. She opened the portfolio. Inside were documents, many documents. The top sheet was a letter in handwriting she now recognized, strong, clear, with a slight rightward slant that suggested impatience or efficiency, she wasn't certain which. Miss Caldwell, as promised, enclosed are the complete terms of the proposed transaction. My solicitor, Mr. Aldrich Pembroke of Pembroke & Sons, has prepared everything with meticulous attention to your specified requirements. You will find a survey map of the properties in question, a detailed accounting of the acreage and its current valuation, the proposed deed transfer with protective covenants, payment terms and schedule, a letter of introduction to Mr. Pembroke. Should you wish to meet with him directly, I have instructed Mr. Pembroke to answer any questions you may have and to make any reasonable modifications you request. This is a business transaction, not a negotiation with predetermined outcomes. Your comfort with the terms matters more than my convenience. One additional note: I will be traveling to Derbyshire next week to inspect the northern boundaries of my current estate. If you would like to see precisely which parcels I'm proposing to purchase, you are welcome to accompany me. No obligation, simply an opportunity to understand exactly what you would be selling and what you would be keeping. The choice, as always, remains yours. Alexander Whitaker. No title. No Duke of Silverton signed with a flourish. Just his name, plain and unadorned, as if he were a country gentleman writing to a neighbor about a fence line dispute. Elizabeth wasn't sure what to make of that. She set the letter aside and pulled out the survey map. It unfurled across the desk, a carefully rendered illustration of land she'd known since childhood, but had never seen depicted this way, as lines and measurements reduced to legal descriptions and acreage counts. Her property was shaded in pale green. The Duke's current holdings were marked in blue. The proposed transfer was cross-hatched in both colors where they met. 300 acres. It was the far northern section, land that had been forested when her grandfather purchased it, and remained largely wild. Good for timber, possibly for sheep, but too far from the manor house to be useful for much else. She'd walked it once as a child, before her mother decided it was too dangerous for unsupervised exploration. She remembered tall trees and a stream that ran cold even in summer. The deed transfer was next. She read it slowly, then read it again. Legal language had a peculiar quality, simultaneously precise and obscure, like a fog that outlined shapes without ever fully revealing them. But even accounting for the elaborate phrasing, the terms seemed remarkably straightforward. The Duke would purchase 300 acres for £15,000. Payment would be made in 3 installments, £5,000 upon signing, £5,000 after 6 months, and the final £5,000 after 1 year. Interest would accrue to her benefit if any payment was delayed. The deed would include permanent covenants restricting development within 1 mile of Caldwell Manor's main house and prohibiting any construction that would obstruct her views to the north. She looked for the trap. There had to be a trap. Men like the Duke of Silverton didn't simply hand unmarried women £15,000 and walk away. There would be a clause somewhere that gave him leverage, an escape provision that rendered her protections meaningless, something that would let him claim the entire estate if she failed to meet some impossible condition. She read every page, every paragraph, every subordinate clause and definition. She found nothing. The document was exactly what he'd promised. A straightforward property transfer with protections for her interests built into the permanent record. If anything, the terms favored her more than him. If he defaulted on any payment, the entire deal would reverse, and she would keep both the land and whatever money he'd already paid. It was the kind of arrangement a father might make to protect a daughter, not the kind a predator would construct to ensnare prey. Elizabeth sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. The plasterwork up there was original to the house, her great-grandfather's commission, installed by craftsmen brought from London at considerable expense. Delicate flowers and vines wound around a central medallion, all of it painted white now, though originally it had been gilt. The gold had flaked away during her childhood, and her mother had decided plain white was more elegant than faded grandeur. What did it mean when someone offered you exactly what they said they would offer? When the promise and the reality aligned so perfectly that suspicion itself became irrational? It meant either genuine integrity or a level of deception so sophisticated she had no hope of detecting it. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, looking apologetic. "Miss Elizabeth," Your cousin is here." "Geoffrey?" Elizabeth felt her stomach clench. "I wasn't expecting him." "Nor was I, miss. But he says it's urgent. Something about papers that need your signature." Of course it was. Geoffrey's visits were always urgent, always involved papers, always arrived at the most inconvenient possible moment. It was as if he had a sixth sense for when she was close to making a decision that didn't involve surrendering control to him. "Put him in the drawing room. Tell him I'll be there shortly." Mrs. Hartwell hesitated. "He asked to speak with you in your father's study, miss. Said the matter was private and he wanted to see the estate ledgers." "The ledgers are none of his concern." "That's what I told him, miss. He said as your nearest male relative and heir presumptive, everything about the estate is his concern." Elizabeth stood, gathering the documents from the Duke into the leather portfolio. "Tell Geoffrey I will see him in the drawing room, or I will not see him at all." "And Mrs. Hartwell? Under no circumstances is he to be left alone in this study, or anywhere else in this house." "Yes, miss." Mrs. Hartwell allowed herself a small smile. "Shall I mention that we have guard dogs now?" "We don't have guard dogs." "He doesn't know that, miss." Despite everything, Elizabeth laughed. "You're a terrible influence, Mrs. Hartwell." "I learned from the best, miss. Your mother could deliver a cut with a smile that would make grown men reconsider their life choices." Elizabeth tucked the portfolio into the desk drawer and locked it. The key went into her pocket. Her mother had indeed been a master of the gracious refusal, the polite destruction. Perhaps it was time to channel that particular inheritance. Geoffrey was standing by the drawing-room window when she entered, hands clasped behind his back in an attitude of proprietary assessment. He'd put on weight since his last visit, she noted. His waistcoat strained slightly across his middle, and his face had taken on the florid quality of a man who enjoyed port more than exercise. "Elizabeth." He turned, not bothering with the courtesy of waiting for her greeting. "You're looking well. Country life seems to agree with you." It was an insult disguised as a compliment, suggesting she'd become some sort of provincial rustic. She decided to ignore it. "Geoffrey, Mrs. Hartwell said this visit was urgent." "Yes, quite." He produced a folder from the leather case he'd set on her mother's favorite chair, without asking, without removing it to a more appropriate location. "I've been reviewing the estate accounts with your father's solicitor. There are some concerning discrepancies. The accounts are current and accurate. That's not what Mr. Dorsey indicates. According to his assessment, you've been selling assets without proper consultation with the family. Furniture, I'm told. Some of your mother's jewelry." Elizabeth felt heat rise in her chest but kept her voice level. "I sold items that belonged to me, to pay debts that were mine to pay. The furniture was from my personal chambers. The jewelry was left to me explicitly in my mother's will. Nevertheless, such decisions should have been discussed with the family, with me." Geoffrey pulled papers from the folder, laying them on the side table without invitation. "I've prepared documents that would establish a proper oversight committee. Nothing invasive, simply a sensible arrangement where major financial decisions require consultation with your male relatives who have more experience in such matters." There it was, the real reason for his visit. Not concern, control. "I don't require oversight, Geoffrey, and I certainly don't require a committee." "Elizabeth, be reasonable. You're 26 years old, unmarried, managing an estate that's clearly beyond your capabilities. This house is falling apart around you. You've let go of most of the staff. Soon you'll have nothing left but pride and an empty manor. If I recall correctly, you offered to purchase this property last year for £8,000, well below market value." Geoffrey's face reddened. "That was a family rate. I was trying to help. You were trying to acquire an estate worth 3 times that amount for a fraction of its value. Don't dress up opportunism as charity, Geoffrey. We're both too old for that particular pretense." "This is exactly the kind of irrationality I'm talking about. You're so determined to maintain some illusion of independence that you can't see when people are genuinely trying to assist you." "Is that what you call it? Assistance?" "What would you call it?" Elizabeth moved to the door, opening it in a gesture that was unmistakably dismissive. "I would call it what it is, an attempt to take advantage of my circumstances for your benefit. Now, I have matters to attend to. I trust you can see yourself out." Geoffrey didn't move. There are legal mechanisms, Elizabeth, ways to establish guardianship when someone is clearly incapable of managing their own affairs. I've been trying to avoid that route out of respect for family, but if you force my hand, then force it. Elizabeth's voice was steady, though her pulse hammered in her ears. Take me to court, Geoffrey. Explain to a judge why you believe a woman who has successfully managed this estate for 6 years, who has paid every debt and maintained every obligation, requires a guardian. I'm quite certain it will be a fascinating legal argument. You won't have the resources to fight it. Legal proceedings are expensive, and you've just admitted you're selling jewelry to pay bills. I sold jewelry to pay my father's outstanding debts ahead of schedule because I believed it was the right thing to do. That's called honor, Geoffrey. You should look into it. For a moment she thought he might actually challenge her physically. His jaw worked, his hands clenched, and something ugly flickered across his face. Then he seemed to remember himself, remember where he was. This isn't over, he said, gathering his papers. Yes, it is. Elizabeth kept the door open, kept her posture relaxed, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. You're not welcome here anymore, Geoffrey. Future correspondence can be directed to my solicitor. You'll regret this, perhaps, but it will be my regret, my decision, my life. That's rather the point. He left finally, brushing past her with more force than necessary. She watched through the window as he climbed into his hired carriage and disappeared down the drive. Only when he was completely out of sight did she allow herself to sink into the nearest chair, hands shaking with delayed reaction. Mrs. Hartwell appeared moments later with tea and biscuits, setting them down without comment. The housekeeper had clearly been listening, which Elizabeth appreciated. Some things required witnesses. That was well done, miss, Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. That was terrifying, Elizabeth corrected. He meant what he said, about the legal proceedings. Let him try. Half the county knows what he's about. The other half will learn quick enough. Elizabeth sipped the tea, grateful for the warmth and the sugar. He's not wrong, though. Legal battles are expensive, and I don't have unlimited resources. You have more than you did an hour ago, miss. Elizabeth looked up sharply. You know about the Duke's offer? I know a courier came with expensive documents. I know you've been reviewing them all morning with the kind of focus you usually reserve for impossible problems. And I know you looked like a woman who'd just been offered a solution right before Master Geoffrey arrived to cause trouble. Mrs. Hartwell settled into the chair across from her, abandoning the usual servant protocols. I also know that your mother, God rest her soul, would tell you that pride is all well and good until it cost you everything that matters. He could be lying, the Duke. This could all be some elaborate scheme. Could be. Or it could be what it appears to be, a business transaction with a man who has enough money that cheating you wouldn't even be worth the effort. It was such a pragmatic assessment that Elizabeth almost laughed. When did you become so cynical? About the same time you became so suspicious. We've both earned it, I'd say. Mrs. Hartwell stood, smoothing her apron. But maybe, just this once, someone is exactly who they claim to be, and maybe that's worth the risk of believing it. After she left, Elizabeth returned to the study and retrieved the portfolio. She read through everything once more, looking for the clause that would undo her, the provision that would give Geoffrey ammunition for his guardianship claim, the trap that would justify her paranoia. She found only what the Duke had promised, a fair deal, clearly stated, with protections for her interests. At the bottom of the portfolio was a separate envelope, smaller than the others. Inside was a single card. If you would like to see the property before deciding, I will be at the Derbyshire estate beginning Monday next. Send word if you wish to meet or don't. Either way, the offer stands. Elizabeth held the card, feeling its weight, its texture. Heavy stock, probably from the same Italian craftsman who made the portfolio. She thought about Geoffrey's threat, about 6 more years of fighting battles she was slowly losing, about the difference between pride and strategy. She thought about Alexander Whitaker standing in her drawing room, admitting he was using her situation to avoid his mother's matchmaking. The surprising honesty of it, the weariness in his eyes that matched her own. What do you think, Mamma? She asked the empty room. Is this foolishness or wisdom? The house creaked its usual afternoon settling sounds, which was not an answer but was somehow still comforting. Elizabeth pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. "Your Grace, I have reviewed the documents. My solicitor will have questions, but preliminarily, the terms appear acceptable. I would like to see the property in question before making a final decision. Please advise where and when I should meet you in Derbyshire. Respectfully, Elizabeth Caldwell." She sealed it, addressed it, and had it sent with the evening post before she could reconsider. It was only after the courier had left that she realized her hands were still shaking. Not with fear this time, but with something that might have been hope. The road to Derbyshire would take 2 days by coach. She would need to arrange accommodation, pack appropriately, bring Jenny as a chaperone. There would be talk, of course, there was always talk. But perhaps Mrs. Hartwell was right. Perhaps some risks were worth taking. Perhaps survival meant knowing when to fight and when to accept an offered hand. Outside, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The gardens her mother had planted were in full bloom now, defiant and beautiful, despite years of reduced care. Elizabeth watched them from the window and made herself a promise. Whatever happened next, she would choose it. Her decision, her risk, her life. The Duke of Silverton had offered her a transaction. What she was accepting, she realized, was the possibility that not every offer came with hidden chains, that sometimes a door opened simply because someone on the other side believed it should. Whether that belief was justified remained to be seen. But for the first time in 6 years, Elizabeth found herself curious about what lay on the other side, instead of simply bracing for the next attack. It was, she decided, progress. The journey to Derbyshire took 3 days instead of 2, because the spring rains had turned the northern roads into ribbons of mud that sucked at carriage wheels and tested the patience of even the most experienced drivers. Elizabeth sat across from Jenny in the hired coach, watching the countryside transform from the gentle hills of home into something wilder and more dramatic. Limestone cliffs that rose like ancient sentinels, valleys that plunged into shadow even at midday, horizons that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the known world. Jenny, who had never travelled more than 10 miles from Caldwell Manor, pressed her face to the window with undisguised wonder. "That's like a different country entirely, miss." "It is, rather." Elizabeth felt it too, that sense of crossing into territory that operated by different rules. The air tasted different here, cleaner, sharper, carrying hints of stone and water and growing things that had never known a gardener's hand. It made her understand why people spoke of the North with a mixture of reverence and wariness, as if the land itself demanded respect. They had sent word ahead to the inn at Ashbourne, a market town that served as the gateway to the Duke's Derbyshire holdings. Elizabeth had been careful in her arrangements, requesting separate rooms, making it clear that Jenny would serve as chaperone, doing everything possible to maintain propriety, while knowing that propriety was a thin shield against determined gossip. By now someone would have noticed the unmarried Miss Caldwell travelling north to meet the bachelor Duke. By the time she returned home, the story would have grown elaborate embellishments, secret engagements, scandalous assignations, depending on who was telling it and what they wanted to believe. Let them talk. She had more important concerns. The inn was older than it looked from the outside, its bones medieval even if its facade had been updated within the last century. The proprietress, Mrs. Blackwell, was a woman of indeterminate age, with shrewd eyes and hands that looked like they'd scrubbed 1,000 floors and would cheerfully scrub 1,000 more. She looked Elizabeth up and down with an assessment that missed nothing and judged less than expected. "Miss Caldwell, your rooms are ready. His Grace sent word you'd be arriving today or tomorrow." She emphasized the plural, rooms, just enough to indicate she'd noted the propriety. "He's asked that you send word when you're settled, and he'll call tomorrow morning if that suits." "That suits very well, thank you. Will you be taking dinner in your room or in the dining room?" Elizabeth glanced at Jenny, who looked exhausted from the travel. "In our rooms tonight, I think. It's been a long journey." "I'll send up something hearty. You look like you could use a proper meal and a good night's sleep." Mrs. Blackwell gestured to a young man hovering near the stairs. "Thomas will take your bags. Breakfast is at 7, but I can arrange earlier or later if you prefer." 7 is perfect." The room was simple but scrupulously clean, with a window that overlooked the town square and a bed that promised actual comfort after 3 nights of questionable inn mattresses. Elizabeth stood at the window, watching the evening activity below. Merchants closing their shops, workers heading home, the ordinary rhythm of a place that existed far from London's society pages and their endless scrutiny. She felt lighter here, as if the distance from home had also created distance from all the weight she'd been carrying, Geoffrey's threats, her dwindling resources, the constant defensive crouch that had become her default posture. Here she was simply a woman on a business trip, nothing more complicated than that. Jenny brought in the dinner tray, setting it on the small table near the window. Mrs. Blackwell wasn't joking about hearty. This is enough food for 4 people. It was indeed substantial: roasted chicken, potatoes, vegetables that tasted like they'd been pulled from a garden that morning, bread that was still warm from the oven. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared exhaustion and mutual understanding. "Are you nervous, miss?" Jenny asked finally. "About tomorrow?" "Terrified," Elizabeth admitted, "though I'm not entirely sure why. It's just land, just a transaction." "It's not, though, not really." Jenny had a way of cutting through pretense that Elizabeth had always valued. "It's your future, your freedom. That's not just anything." "No, it's not." Elizabeth pushed food around her plate, suddenly not hungry despite the excellent cooking. "What if I'm making a mistake? What if I should have fought longer, held out, refused to sell anything?" "Then you'd have lost it all when your cousin forced the sale anyway. At least this way you get to choose." Jenny reached across the table, squeezed Elizabeth's hand briefly. "Your mother used to say that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing anyway. She was braver than I am." "She was older than you are. Give yourself time." After dinner, Elizabeth tried to read but found her attention wandering. She tried to sleep but found herself staring at the ceiling, mind racing through scenarios and possibilities. Finally, she gave up and moved to the window, watching the stars emerge over the Derbyshire hills. Somewhere out there was the land in question. 300 acres of forest and stream, of ground that had been in her family for 3 generations, and would now become someone else's. It should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like possibility. The strange lightness that comes from setting down a burden you didn't realize you'd been carrying. Morning came too quickly, and not quickly enough. Elizabeth dressed carefully in a practical walking dress, knowing they'd be covering rough terrain. She plaited her hair simply, refusing to fuss over appearance beyond basic propriety. This was business. She would treat it as such. The Duke arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, punctual in a way that spoke of military training or exceptional discipline. He was dressed for riding and walking, in clothes that were clearly expensive but showed signs of actual use. This was not a man who kept separate wardrobes for looking at property and for show. "Miss Caldwell." He bowed, correct and formal. "I hope your journey was tolerable. Long but uneventful, Your Grace. Thank you for arranging the accommodations. I'm familiar with the roads this time of year. I thought the extra day was prudent." He gestured toward the door. "I have horses if you ride, or we can take a carriage to the property line and walk from there." "I ride." Something flickered in his expression. Approval, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement. "Excellent. It's easier to see the boundaries on horseback." Jenny was to remain at the inn, which Elizabeth knew would cause talk but was unavoidable. You couldn't have a chaperone on horseback covering rough terrain, and you couldn't see land properly from a carriage. She would simply have to accept the scandal and move forward. The Duke's horse was a massive grey gelding that looked like it could carry a knight in full armour without complaint. The mare he'd brought for Elizabeth was smaller, but had intelligent eyes and a calm demeanour that suggested she was used to uncertain riders. Elizabeth mounted without assistance, which seemed to please him, and they set off toward the north. The town fell away quickly, replaced by open country that rolled and climbed in ways that made her understand why people built walls here, not just to mark boundaries, but to keep the wind from stealing everything not anchored to stone. They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the horses' hooves and the wind through the grass. "Your property begins at that ridgeline," the Duke said finally, pointing to a dark line of trees perhaps a mile distant. "The stream marks the western boundary, and the old stone wall, you can just see it there, marks the east. Elizabeth looked where he indicated, trying to see what he saw. Not just land, but potential, value, strategic advantage. What will you do with it? Timber in the short term. There are good stands of oak and ash that are mature enough for harvest. In the longer term, possibly sheep. The terrain is too rough for extensive agriculture, but it would support grazing. He glanced at her. Nothing that would disturb your views or your peace. I meant what I said about the protective covenants. Why does that matter to you? My peace? Because I've seen what happens when powerful people ride roughshod over those with less leverage. It creates enemies and instability. I prefer arrangements where both parties feel they've been treated fairly. That's remarkably principled for a duke. That's remarkably cynical for a woman barely past her mid-20s. Elizabeth surprised herself by smiling. I've earned my cynicism honestly. I don't doubt it. They had reached the ridgeline now, and he dismounted, offering his hand to help her down. She took it, feeling the strength in his grip, the calluses that spoke of someone who did more than sign documents and attend parties. Come, I want to show you something. He led her through the trees, following what might have been a game trail, or might simply have been the path of least resistance through the undergrowth. The forest was older here, the trees massive enough that their canopy blocked most of the light, creating a green twilight that smelled of moss and earth and time. They emerged at a clearing where a stream cut through stone, creating a series of small waterfalls that caught the light and threw it back in fragments of silver and rainbow. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with human intention, just water and rock, and the patient work of centuries. This is the heart of the property, Alexander said quietly. I wanted you to see it before you decided, so you'd know exactly what you're selling. Elizabeth moved to the stream's edge, watching the water flow over stone worn smooth by its passage. She had been here as a child, she realized. This was the place her mother had forbidden her to explore alone, the wild place beyond the boundaries of supervised childhood. Standing here now, she understood why. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was the kind of place that made you want to stay, to abandon responsibility and simply exist in the presence of something older and more permanent than human concerns. It's beautiful, she said finally. It is. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth against the cool air rising from the water. I won't lie to you, Miss Caldwell. I want this land, but I don't want it at the cost of your regret. If you sell it to me and spend the rest of your life wishing you hadn't, then I've gained property and lost something more valuable. What could possibly be more valuable to a duke than property? The belief that I'm better than the circumstances of my birth, that I can have power without abusing it, that I can want something and still care about the cost to others. He picked up a smooth stone from the stream bed, turned it over in his hand. My father was a good man, by most accounts. Fair landlord, generous with the church, all the things that earn you a favorable obituary. But he never questioned whether he had the right to the power he wielded. He simply accepted it as natural order. And you question it? Constantly, to the point of exhausting myself and everyone around me. He tossed the stone into the water, watching the ripples spread. I don't know if that makes me better or simply more paralyzed by doubt. But I'd rather be paralyzed occasionally than certain I'm right when I'm causing harm. Elizabeth found herself seeing him differently, not as the Duke of Silverton, not as the man offering her £15,000, but as someone who carried his own weight of expectation and uncertainty, someone who understood that power was not the same as freedom. I want to sell it to you, she said, not because I need the money, though God knows I do, but because I think you'll treat it with respect, and because keeping it means fighting battles I can't win, and I'm tired of losing. You're not losing, you're choosing strategy over stubbornness. There's a difference. My cousin doesn't think so. Your cousin is a fool. Alexander said it matter-of-factly, without heat. I made some inquiries after our first meeting. Geoffrey Caldwell has debts that would make a sailor blush, and ambitions that far exceed his capabilities. If he gets control of your estate, it will be stripped and sold within 2 years. You investigated him? I investigate everyone I do business with. It's not personal, it's prudent. He turned to face her fully. He's planning to petition for guardianship. You probably already know that. But what you might not know is that he's been meeting with your father's former solicitor, the one who's been helping him document your supposed mismanagement. Elizabeth felt something cold settle in her stomach. Mr. Dorsey? The same. They're building a case that you're mentally unfit to manage your own affairs, selling heirlooms, dismissing staff, refusing advantageous marriage proposals. They're framing it all as evidence of instability rather than practical necessity. How do you know this? Because Mr. Dorsey made the mistake of approaching one of my solicitors, trying to gather evidence of your supposed recklessness, and agreeing to meet with me without proper oversight. My man reported it immediately. Alexander's expression was grim. They're planning to file within the month, which means you need to finalize this sale quickly before they can claim you're entering into contracts you don't understand. Elizabeth sank onto a fallen log, mind racing. She had known Geoffrey was a threat, but she hadn't realized how organized he was, how far he'd already progressed in his campaign to seize control. What do I do? You sign my documents today. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today. We backdate them if necessary to establish that you entered into this agreement before any guardianship petition was filed. Once the sale is recorded, you'll have capital, which makes it much harder to argue you're financially incompetent. And you'll have proof that you negotiated a complex transaction successfully, which undermines their entire case. That's why you wanted me to come here, not to see the land. I wanted you to see the land because you deserve to know what you're selling. But yes, the timing was strategic. I'm sorry for the manipulation, but I thought the truth would frighten you away. Elizabeth laughed, a sound without much humor. You thought knowing my cousin is trying to have me declared incompetent would frighten me away from a business deal. Most people prefer gentle lies to harsh truths. I'm not most people. No, he agreed. You're not. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the water. Elizabeth felt the weight of decision pressing against her chest, but it was different now. Not the paralysis of fear, but the sharp clarity of limited options. She could refuse, return home and fight Geoffrey in court with dwindling resources and mounting evidence he'd manufactured. Or she could trust this man she barely knew and make a choice that secured her immediate future, even if it cost her some of her land. Pride versus strategy. Her father's voice in her head, steady and pragmatic. Learn the difference. I'll sign today, she said, on one condition. Name it. Tell me the truth, all of it. Why you're really doing this. I don't believe it's just about avoiding your mother's matchmaking or wanting 300 acres of timber rights. There's something else. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. I told you my father was a good man. That was true. But good men can still cause harm through inaction. When I was 16, there was a family on our estate, tenants who'd been there for generations. The father died, leaving a widow and 3 daughters. Under the lease terms, they had to leave because there was no male heir to inherit the tenancy. He picked up another stone but didn't throw it. My father was sympathetic but firm. Rules were rules. The lease was clear. They had 3 months to vacate. I watched them pack up everything they'd ever known and move to Manchester to work in factories. One of the daughters was my age. We'd grown up playing together on the estate. She looked at me the day they left with this expression I've never forgotten. Not anger, not even sadness. Just this quiet acceptance that her life mattered less than our property rights. What happened to them? The mother died within the year. Factory work in those conditions was brutal. The daughters survived, but barely. I tried to help later, sent money through intermediaries. They sent it back. He finally threw the stone, harder than necessary. I learned then that some damage can't be undone with belated charity. That power unused to prevent harm is just another form of causing it. So you're trying to make amends. I'm trying not to be my father. I'm trying to use the power I inherited in ways that don't create more stories like that one. He turned to her. You remind me of her, that girl. Not in appearance, but in that look. The one that says you've learned to expect less from the world because it's easier than hoping for better. I don't want to be another person who teaches you that lesson. Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest, some wall she'd built over 6 years of defensive living, developing the first hairline crack. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're fighting to keep your autonomy in a world designed to strip it from you. I know you're smart enough to recognize help when it's offered, but too scarred to trust it. I know you returned my letter unopened because saying no was the only power you felt you still possessed. He met her eyes. And I know that if I were in your position, I would do exactly the same thing. Which means I owe you the kind of arrangement I would want for myself. Fair, transparent, protective of your interests, even when you're not in the room to defend them. That's why the protective covenants are so detailed. That's why every clause in those documents assumes you might someday need to enforce them against me, without resources or leverage. I built in protections you might never use, but if you do need them, they'll hold up in any court in England. Elizabeth stood, brushing dirt from her dress. The stream continued its patient work, wearing down stone, reshaping the landscape one molecule at a time. She thought about her mother's quiet steel, her father's pragmatism, the generations of Caldwells who had built and preserved and passed down this land. What would they want for her? Safety wrapped in surrender, or risk taken in pursuit of freedom? "Let's go back," she said. "I want to sign these documents before I talk myself out of it." They rode back to town in silence, but it was a different quality of silence, not awkward but comfortable, the quiet of two people who had reached an understanding. At the inn, Alexander's solicitor was waiting with papers already prepared, requiring only signatures and witnesses. Mrs. Blackwell and her husband served that function, signing their names with the careful precision of people who understood they were participating in something significant. Elizabeth signed her name across document after document, each signature a small act of trust and terror. When it was done, Alexander produced a bank draft for the first installment, £5,000 made out in her name, backed by institutions that would not fail or default. "This is real," she said, holding the draft like it might dissolve in her hands. "It's real," he confirmed. "Your solicitor will want to review everything, and you can still withdraw if you find anything objectionable. But yes, as far as I'm concerned, this is a binding agreement." Elizabeth looked at the draft, at the signatures, at the man who had just handed her more money than she'd seen in 6 years. "Why do I still feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop?" "Because you've been conditioned to expect betrayal. It will take time before you believe that some people mean what they say." He gathered the documents into a leather case. "I'll have copies sent to your solicitor by the end of the week. The land transfer will be recorded within the month. The next payment will come in 6 months exactly as specified." "And then what?" "Then you repair your house, hire back your staff, tell Jeffrey to go to hell, and live your life on your own terms." He paused at the door. "Or you invest the money and travel, or you start a business, or you do nothing at all and simply enjoy the freedom of having choices. The point, Miss Caldwell, is that the choice becomes yours. Genuinely, actually yours." After he left, Elizabeth sat in her room with the bank draft on the table before her. £5,000, enough to change everything, enough to breathe without the constant pressure of impending disaster. Jenny came in, took one look at her face, and sat down without speaking. They sat together as the afternoon light shifted across the floorboards, marking time's passage in gold and shadow. "Did you do it, miss?" Jenny asked finally. "I did it. How do you feel?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously. How did she feel? Terrified and exhilarated, guilty for selling land her grandfather had purchased, relieved beyond measure, angry that she'd been forced into this position, grateful for the unexpected grace of someone who could have taken advantage but chose not to. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time in 6 years, I feel free." The journey home took 3 days, the same roads traversed in reverse. But Elizabeth experienced them differently now, not as passage through dangerous territory, but as simply distance covered, obstacles managed, progress made. She watched the landscape shift from Derbyshire's drama back to her home county's gentler hills, and felt herself shift as well, from defensive crouch to something more like balanced readiness. When Caldwell Manor came into view, she saw it with new eyes, not as a fortress under siege, but as a home she had chosen to keep. The gardens were still blooming, The stones still stood, and now they would continue to stand, not despite her choices, but because of them. Mrs. Hartwell met her at the door, reading her face with the accuracy of long association. "It went well, then?" "It went well." Elizabeth handed her the bank draft. "Take this to our bank tomorrow. Then find Mr. Fletcher and ask him what it would cost to hire back the staff we let go. Not all of them, but enough to run this house properly." "Yes, miss." Mrs. Hartwell looked at the draft, at Elizabeth, back at the draft. "Is this real?" "Apparently so." "Then I suppose we have work to do." The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. Staff hired, repairs begun, debts settled in full, with the satisfaction of watching creditors' expressions shift from skepticism to respect. Elizabeth met with her own solicitor, who reviewed every document and pronounced them not just acceptable but exemplary in their protection of her interests. Geoffrey appeared once more, papers in hand, threats on his lips. Elizabeth received him in her father's study, newly restored and looking every inch the domain of someone in complete control of her circumstances. She let him deliver his speech about guardianship petitions and legal proceedings, then handed him a letter from her solicitor detailing exactly how much money she now controlled and precisely how expensive it would be to challenge her competence in court. "I think you'll find," she said calmly, "that judges are less sympathetic to guardianship petitions when the supposedly incompetent person has just negotiated a complex property transaction worth £15,000. But by all means, Geoffrey, waste your money trying." He left without another word. She never saw him again. 6 months later, the second installment arrived exactly as promised. Elizabeth used it to repair the roof, restore the gardens to their former glory, and commission a new portrait of her parents to replace the one that had been damaged by water leakage. She hung it in the drawing room where Alexander Whittaker had first stood, examining her family's legacy, while she decided whether to trust him. The final installment came 12 months after that, punctual to the day. By then, Elizabeth had built something new from the foundation of her parents' legacy, not just a preserved estate, but a working farm, a solvent household, a life that belonged entirely to her own design. She never saw the Duke of Silverton again after that day in Derbyshire, though she heard of him occasionally through the inevitable channels of society gossip. He had eventually married, though not Lady Caroline Pemberton. His wife was reportedly the daughter of a diplomat, a woman who spoke 4 languages and had travelled half the world before she turned 25. They seemed happy by all accounts, which pleased Elizabeth more than she'd expected. Once, perhaps 3 years after their transaction, she received a letter bearing his familiar handwriting. It contained no return address, no signature, just a single sentence. "I hope you're choosing your own adventures." She folded it carefully and placed it in the desk drawer where she kept important documents, not because it was legally significant, but because it represented something else. Proof that some people meant what they said. That power could be wielded with care. That trust, carefully given and faithfully kept, could change everything. On warm afternoons, Elizabeth sometimes rode north to the boundary of what had been her property, where 300 acres of forest continued their patient growth under new ownership. She never crossed onto the Duke's land. That would have been improper, but she stood at the borderline and listened to the wind through the trees, to the sound of the stream she'd visited once on a day that changed her life. The land was gone, but she remained. The inheritance was transformed, but her freedom was intact. She had chosen strategy over pride, trust over fear, and the choice had given her back her life. Standing there, with the sun on her face and the wind in her hair, and all of her future stretching before her, unmarked and uncertain and entirely her own, Elizabeth Caldwell felt something she had not felt since she was 20, and her parents were alive, and the world seemed infinite with possibility. She felt young, not in years. She would never have those back, and she wasn't certain she'd want them given what she'd learned in their absence. But young, in the way that matters more, the belief that tomorrow might contain something better than yesterday. The conviction that choices made with clear eyes and steady hands could lead somewhere worth going. The roses her mother had planted were blooming in the manor gardens. The staff she'd rehired were singing in the kitchen. The accounts were balanced. the debts were settled, and the future was a story she would write herself. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for staying with us through this entire journey. We hope Elizabeth and Alexander's story touched your heart and reminded you that sometimes taking a risk on trust can change everything. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, leave a comment telling us your favorite moment, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you'll never miss our future stories. And if you'd like to support our channel and help us create more content like this, there's a support link in the first pinned comment below. Your support means the world to us and allows us to keep bringing you these stories. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of our community. And until next time, may you always have the courage to choose your own adventures.